Eric.
Omar.
We had a little bit of controversy in that last episode.
I don't remember what it was, but I think it's just because I've become so numb to controversy at this point that I just expect it, you know?
Yeah, they are always after us. So if it's a constant attack, it's not a persecution complex on our end. It's a legitimate, definable threat, existential threat to us. We had Joe Sullivan on. We had perhaps mentioned, I'm not sure what is canon, we spoke about Kevin Costner's filmography in a previous episode, and we both agreed that's how Eric is in simpatico with me, why we're stuck together. I asked you what's his best work, and you said ironically Waterworld, and we started laughing, and then we brought this up to Joe because it's just the perfect time. He said something related, something related to the 90s. With his father, and we said, man, doesn't Waterworld suck? And he said it's one of his favorite films. So we're just isolating guests.
Not even joking.
Yeah,
He's
not even joking.
He was literally like he had the VHS tape, watched it multiple times. He knew about the gills, everything. So yeah, it was an awkward moment, but it also made me realize that the kayfabe, partially real reality of Iron Culture is actually the real life of Joe Sullivan. So if he's not a cultist, I don't know who is. Even though he's never listened to the podcast, which is also an amazing and awkward moment that we had, which is great. It's great.
So tangent, of course, but it is entirely relevant to exactly what you just said. The owner of Fortis Fitness basically is a perfect real life cosplayer of Henry Rollins. However, he doesn't actually, Eric, you know what I'm saying? He doesn't know who Henry Rollins is. And then I showed him some of his music. Well, I'm like, ideologically, some of the things you'd be aligned with like anti-corporatism, like, because that's Sean in a nutshell. And he's like, yeah, I don't like this music though. It's too abrasive. I like smoother things like funk, jazz. Anyways, so he does not know this guy.
In Henry Rollins' voice. That's great.
And he says it in a Henry Rollins voice, and he looks like Henry Rollins, except he actually doesn't know him. He said shit. Have you ever read Henry Rollins, his article, 200 pounds will feel like 200 pounds? Like, I forget what it's called, but that's one of the...
Yeah. Back in the... Yeah,
it's a solid article. Sean has said shit like that also, but he didn't really know who this guy is. And then when he heard his music, it's not for me. I'm like, okay.
It makes you wonder if Henry Rollins actually...
Yeah.
I mean, he's older, so don't think about this too much, folks.
Don't think about it too much.
If Henry Rollins met Sean and then was like, that's who I'm going to make my persona, Yeah,
he's like, I'm going to take him over. We got a classic case of the double, folks, of who is the real one. I will say, Eric, just in passing then, too, that it wasn't only Joe Sullivan that doubled down on Waterworld being awesome. There were like 3 or 4 comments on our YouTube of cultists. And I just want to say it's kind of lonely at the top, for us when we look down.
I was actually just impressed. There were some kings speaking truth to us. Their truth, not truth, because obviously Waterworld is terrible, to be clear. But they were speaking their truths, and I can only respect that.
So, Eric, I'm going to do the deep dive, and then there's actually a very interesting something that's coming up for Mass that will kick it off. We'll kick it off with a little case study here. They'll be entirely relevant to the cult with some, interesting observations. But I'm going to go off the deep end here, man. RoboCop, the original Paul Verhoeven's. Classic. When we're talking, so anyway, so many things.
One of the classic cyberpunk movies.
Absolutely. Oh my God. Yes. It's also subversive in all the best ways in terms of the media, how it's, anyways. So Peter Weller, low-key, we spoke about that. We spoke about that off where he got his PhD in classics, I think, and he also shown on the History Channel. Cool. Anyways, there was a project. I could be misspeaking here because I think I got 1 out of the 3 things. Ribaldry, I still don't know.
You were not hitting them at the park last time.
No.
You should be circumspect as you say this.
I was barely bunting them at that point. I was hitting our own teammates. It's all over the place. But anyways, I think that the director that either did Empire Strikes Back or Return of the Jedi did a film, an underwater film. So there is a film with Peter Weller called Leviathan that started...
So the director of Empire Strikes Back is George Lucas, right?
Empire is Ivan Kershner or something like that. Yeah, if you look at it. So he did the first one, but like he handed off, I think, to his professor. Are you gonna look this up?
You go ahead. You say what you want to say. I'll tell you.
So anyway,
I'm going to tell you afterwards.
Okay, please. Can you look at Eric? Do this on air right now, Levi. I want to know if I strike out here, man. But he directed it, and what's the guy's name? Ernie Hudson. From Ghostbusters also. Anyways, you think it starts off really good, the film, I gotta be honest. The first 10 minutes and the creature effects that they use, I think they got the same people that did The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, but it's a great reveal, kind of like Waterworld, in that from its outset, it seems intriguing, and then it quickly falls apart. But Peter Weller's an underrated actor from the 80s is what I was going to say. If we're putting some shine on Kevin Costner, Mr. RoboCop himself. Come on, Eric, slay me right now. Am I right? Am I wrong?
Okay, so we're talking about Leviathan, the 1989 film.
Exactly.
Right?
Who directed it, baby? Come on, am I right or am I wrong?
Directed by George P. Cosmatos.
Oh, shit, I'm way wrong. And oh, no, Eric, I'm out.
And written by, no, you got part of it right. And written by David Webb Peoples and Jeb Stewart. It stars Peter Weller.
Yes.
So you got that.
Yeah.
And that is all you got right.
What about Ernie Hudson? He's also one of the cast members.
Okay,
right?
no. It stars Peter Weller, Richard Crenna, Ernie Hudson, and Daniel Stern.
Okay, so I got that direct wrong. Shit. Eric, what's that? We're batting.
Weren't you saying it was someone who was on the same thing as Thing as well, or no?
So the some of the
I only
creature
had
effects.
half an ear listening.
The creature effects. The creature effects for sure. Because I was watching like a mini doc on it. But anyways, the way they filmed it, when the creatures revealed.
Okay. Wikipedia's gotten so much better over the years. Four-time Oscar-winning visual effects designer Stan Winston was responsible for the creature effects.
Oh, yeah.
And he, yes, you're correct, was best known for his work in the Terminator series, the first 3 Jurassic Park films, Aliens, The Thing.
Thank you.
So you nailed it. The first 2 Predator films, and also such classics as Inspector Gadget.
So. Nice. So I did get the director. That's pretty big, though, to fuck up the director, though. Like, let's be real here.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, you are 1 for 4. And anytime you make a claim before I know that you looked it up, I am going to start just betting on the exact opposite being true.
Oh, my God. So
playing the odds.
That I now we're going to have someone. That's a hardcore pick, because if someone goes to bat for Leviathan, hopefully they're like me, they're going to strike out. But at the same time, I do appreciate how the banter, and we could throw it in with people like Joe Sullivan, who is and always has been a member of the cult, whether he's aware of it or not. He lives it, he breathes it, you know?
No, 100%. It was pretty cool to have somebody on who, like, in all seriousness, he said, like, straight up, guys, you know, I have ADD. I do not listen to podcasts, and that includes yours. Yeah. And then he went on to proceed to explain exactly what is at the heart of iron culture, and that was pretty cool. So it is. It gave me, to be serious for a moment, it gave me a little confidence in that we are speaking to the heart of something, that we are getting at the core of at least one throughput thread to a lot of different elements and communities in the iron game, which was our whole goal at the start. So it's good because, you know, I mean, to be really candid, as someone who has been kind of more isolated in the like drug-free side of the sport and has my own perspective as a researcher and kind of being a little more evidence-based, I do wonder, like, am I like, does some of like the hardcore, like, you know, like the people who look at West Side versus the World and they're like, that's right, brother. I don't look at it that way. You know, I kind of look at that. I have a different experience of it. Like, I respect and appreciate, and I've shared some of those experiences, but when I look at that, that doesn't feel like my people. Mm-hmm. So I think there is only so much that, even though I have participated in a lot of different sports, and even though I've partnered with you, and you do have a little more connection to that side and a little more connection to, I would say, certain other elements that I'm not super connected with, but I would say you and I share a lot more Venn diagram than we don't. Yeah. So I think it's really important that we make sure to have people on the podcast who can, like you know, make those connections that it would be, honestly, even if we wanted to, it'd be inauthentic for us to do so. Yeah. So I was just really appreciative of Joe. So Joe, if you're listening, and I know you're not, thank you so much for being on.
Oh my God. I love these intros, Eric. Okay. Perfectly well said. I do now want to get to the topic you wanted to share, Eric. And it's something that one of the tonics of the cult are hunks being hunky, right?
Yep.
And so we're talking now about peak week. We're talking about getting downright yucky. We're talking about water here. We're talking about, you know, for me, Eric, I remember when I posed in front of you and I said, I think I'm about 3 weeks out. And you said, put a 1 year in front of that and you're somewhere there. This is going to be relevant to me.
Carry the one.
You carry the one.
And you're solid.
Yeah, you're solid. But I think this is very intriguing, this case study you're about to share, for its potential implications. Now, with that being said, it is a case study, but as someone who's a competitor, who's coached a lot of people, and, you're trying to, now, everyone collectively is trying to uncover some of the research, what it could possibly actually mean. I think this is some of the value within case studies, taking a real look at a competitor, what they do, and what some of the potential outcomes are in order to better inform us in terms of what's going on.
Yeah. So first, I just want to give a big shout out to Chris Barakat, who's a guest of the show, someone I consider a personal friend, and just a good guy. He's a very, very serious coach and competitor who's just down with the sport, which I love. And he's also someone who's really interested in science and conducts research. And he has a great relationship with the University of Tampa, where he's able to do some research there. And he recently did some old school science. You know how like back in the day, like in the Victorian era, who was your research subject? You put yourself under the microscope. So he is, and this is publicly available in the open access publication. You can see this. They disclose who the case study participant is Chris Barakat, who's also the lead author. Which they also stated, as they should, as a limitation. Obviously there is, as the researcher, you're going to go into an observational period with certain prior experiences and therefore unavoidable biases and hypotheses. And there's no avoiding that. That's not a critique. That's the same thing would be true of me. Of course, there's very few threats to the validity of this because it's a case study. So it's an observation of what happened in one person. So it is really useful. And you're probably going like, why are we doing case studies of one? Isn't that something that is not very applicable to a broader population? And the context is everything here. This is specifically a case study of one of the peaks or the peak week protocols before getting on stage that Chris did in his 2021 season, which was very successful. So, and I think that's really useful because we are just now starting to accumulate empirical evidence on how peak weeks operate, what levers that bodybuilders are pulling, how do those impact physiology, and how does it impact appearance, and then how are those two things connected? And this is a really interesting topic because despite the kind of false dichotomy of like science and bro science, all bodybuilders have been incredibly science interested since the get-go. Yeah. If we go all the way back to like Professor Attila and Sandow, like there's always been like the guru figure that's been around in bodybuilding culture as kind of like the science-based person. Oftentimes it is bullshit, or they're mostly just promoting science as a marketing tool. But many times they're legitimate exercise science professors who are maybe a little iconoclastic in the era where, resistance training was not viewed as a positive thing. Go back to our episodes with Connor Heffernan, but going all the way back over a century, there is this clear interest in science and using science to build the body. And honestly, like sometimes people characterize the enhanced side as doing more and more bro science. I would say they are doing legitimate science with like pharmacy and pharmaceuticals, but in an area where there is not research and they're just a little more experimental, a little less risk averse, as we talked about with Joe Sullivan, and more willing to be experimental, even sometimes at the risk to their own well-being, if to see if they can push the sport further. And say what you want about that from a whatever perspective you want. I think it's really interesting, and it does show a devotion to learning and innovation and experimenting. So I think that kind of spirit that existed in the early phases of science, that was there because there wasn't the same kind of institutional support that science has today. There was not a network of R1 universities getting NIH grant funding and international connections and conferences that people travel to around the world and online journals. The position we're in today, where there's more and more and more and more and more research getting published on a day-to-day basis, is a very privileged one. It's awesome, and it's because science has advanced and the community of science has moved forward. But that community can only get applied to topics that also have that same community interest. So obviously getting yacked on game day and looking amazing is something that is still in its infancy from an empirical perspective, but it has been surrounded by scientific theories and hypotheses for a long time. And so anyway, I wanted to review this case study in mass. So it will be coming out on September 1st, so which will just be about a week after this episode drops. So you can definitely check out the full text. You can check out the full text of the case study and also the full text of my article as a mass subscriber. But for those who aren't mass subscribers, we're going to talk about it pretty in depth here today. First thing I do want to give a shout out, Chris Barakat. He gave me the time of day as a lead author. I wanted to make sure that my understanding of the data was accurate. If there's anything that didn't actually make it into the final publication that was relevant, and he gave me some useful insights. And I've also recently had the opportunity to talk to Scott Stevenson, one of the co-authors, and Guillermo Escalante, Dr. Escalante and Dr. Stevenson. I can't get into it too much, but let's just say us and a bunch of other people who are involved in the science of bodybuilding are working on a large-scale project that will be very beneficial to the bodybuilding community. But it has really required us to have some of these discussions around do we know what we know and how do things actually operate? And it's a difficult thing to write something that is quote-unquote evidence-based when the evidence is still being accumulated. So I think peak week is one of those things that we don't yet have figured out. And what I want to do to kick this off, Omar, is I want to present like two different quote-unquote seemingly evidence-based perspectives on how peak week should operate, right? And these are things that you could have references behind a lot of the claims I make. Okay, so here's recommendation one. That is one of the visual effects. Thank you very much for Brandon for putting that in. So recommendation one is that what you should do early in the week is load carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are stored in muscle as glycogen, and they're osmotic, meaning they pull water with them. So glycogen is stored with water at a ratio of roughly 3-to-1. So every 1 gram of glycogen, there's 3 grams of water, meaning it can enhance muscle fullness, and it also ensures that there's a certain level of muscle hydration. Therefore, you can make your muscles bigger. Also, the way that water balance in different water compartments is maintained is by what's called the sodium-potassium pump in the body. And this is an element of biochemistry that basically water follows sodium. And potassium levels, if they are higher, they maintain a slightly higher concentration gradient favoring the intracellular space. And if sodium is higher, it favors the extracellular space. So if sodium levels are low, if potassium levels are high, we can shift more fluid to the intracellular space. So therefore, what we want to do is we want to have lower sodium later in the week, higher potassium earlier in the week. We want to load carbohydrates, and then we want to actually start restricting water and doing different dehydration practices so that we can lose water from the extracellular space and maintain the water and the glycogen in the muscle because we've loaded that glycogen, so it's maintaining at least that 3-to-1 ratio. We've got potassium high, so we're not going to be dehydrating the intracellular space, and therefore we'll lose water from the extracellular space, which includes the subcutaneous layer, and we're going to look yucky as hell. We're going to have still those big full muscles, and as we dehydrate, we're going to preferentially lose that water from the subcutaneous space. It's going to shrink wrap our muscles, and we're going to look peaked and shredded. And I could have had maybe 2 or 3 references to support that based upon physiological principles. All right, that's recommendation one. All right, you ready for recommendation two, Omar?
Oh, yeah.
All right, thanks again, Brandon. So water is stored with glycogen in muscle cells because glycogen is osmotic, and it is stored at a minimum of about a 3-to-1 ratio, but in a well-hydrated muscle can be stored as high as, say, a 17-to-1 ratio. So you can have a lot more intramuscular glycogen with a well-hydrated muscle. Muscle is also roughly 3/4 water, and for every 1% loss of body weight from dehydration, you see roughly an equivalent 1% loss in muscle hydration. So it's critical that you maintain high levels of hydration to maintain muscle size. So not only should we be carbohydrate loading, but we also want to keep water high. In addition, we see that the process of contest preparation typically results in reductions in blood pressure. This has been observed in case studies where there's about a 20% reduction in systolic and diastolic blood pressure over the course of a 24-week diet. that loss of blood pressure is potentially a problem for your pump. In addition, we know that acute increases in sodium or acute decreases in sodium can result in acute changes in blood pressure. So it's very important to actually increase sodium as you get closer to the show to hopefully offset that loss in blood pressure. We also know that the GLUT4 transporter in the gut for carbohydrate is sodium dependent, meaning that we want to make sure that sodium is amply supplied so that we can effectively fill out from carbohydrates. So what you should do is load carbohydrates early in the week, maintain a high water intake, and don't worry about water retention because we know that urinary output scales with hydration. You drink more, you pee more. So you can stay hydrated, but also prevent excess water retention. And then you're going to acutely load sodium before you do your pump up and get on stage. This also could have had, 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 references behind it. So what I hope I demonstrated there is that you can create a scientific hypothesis for the same thing, and it can be the polar opposite and completely opposed to another scientific hypothesis. So I want to give a shout out to the rest of the MASS team that came on for our episode, Rationalism versus Empiricism. And this is why it's so important that we're actually doing this research, because we've had evidence-based narratives in the peaking space that go back to the 80s. And that first example I gave is the more traditional narrative, right? It's based upon, basic physiological principles. It's based upon a lot of studies on carbohydrate loading in endurance athletes and some mechanistic studies on, water balance, sodium, potassium, etc. And the second explanation I gave, while I tend to favor that explanation, that's the one that I think makes a little more sense, and I'll explain why in more detail. It is also a hypothesis. So people have claimed that, I use an evidence-based peaking strategy when using either the latter or the former, but I would say, honestly, neither one's evidence-based. They're both what I would describe as hypotheses. They're super sciencey, they've got references, and you can write a narrative review about that, but it's not evidence-based because we don't have any direct comparative empirical comparisons of people manipulating these variables except for some parts of this. So I think we talked about this on Iron Culture before. We do have some research on carbohydrate loading. There was a cool quasi-experimental study done in 2019 by Desmarais and colleagues where they separated bodybuilders who had carb loaded, meaning they took in like 10 grams per kg or higher, or those who took in 5 grams per kilogram or less in immediate period before the show. And they looked at changes in circumferences, and they also looked at changes in silhouette scores, like actual photos of them made into a silhouette and then shown to judges. And the bodybuilders who loaded carbohydrate, they had improvements in their silhouette scores and improvements in their circumferences, increases, while the bodybuilders that did not. So we have quasi-experimental support, which is probably about the best we're going to get with some of these strategies. Like carbohydrate loading is, I would say, a proven strategy now. We know it works. But as far as the actual quote-unquote drying out process, which is part of the traditional narrative, and it's very common on the enhanced side of the fence as well, of manipulating potentially sodium, maybe as well as potassium, and restricting water to some degree, or doing something to create dehydration or diuresis, that has never really been empirically tested. And this case study, I wouldn't say it's empirically, quote unquote, testing it. It is an empirical observation of it, but it's not like, we compared Chris to someone else. Yeah. But what they did do, which is an important step, is they got the highest quality that is currently available to us of assessing body water compartments, at least with one assessment tool, which is important. So I'll get to this case study in a moment, but I want to take a step back and talk about a study that was published just earlier this year, I think in February or March, and it's by Nunes and colleagues. I brought it up on Iron Culture not too long ago, but the title of that study, like I said, by Nunes and colleagues, was changes in intra to extracellular water ratio and bioelectrical parameters from day before to day of competition in bodybuilders, a case study. And what they did was they took 11 bodybuilders, I think this was in Brazil, if I recall correctly, and they just got them at weigh-ins, and they did a bioimpedance test, they measured some circumferences, and then they repeated that on game day. And the interesting thing about it was that they did actually improve some of their anthropometric markers from day prior to day of. I think their arm circumference went up and their waist circumference went down in one day. So something they're doing is working. And that has been observed for a long time. So we've got this study that just happened back in Feb, but we can go all the way back to the early 90s. There was a study by Bauman where they also observed an increase in arm circumference in these high-level bodybuilders in like the last day prior to the competition. I don't think these people are gaining muscle like one day out, right? So we have elements of this story, but we don't have all the connecting pieces. We know that almost all bodybuilders are doing some type of peaking protocol. When we look at studies on bodybuilders from the 90s on the enhanced side of it, they're all doing it. And then when we there was a recent survey of 81 natural competitors from the UK, and I think like 94% of them did something in peak week different from their normal. So more than 9 out of 10 bodybuilders, I would guess, are manipulating the final week. And probably with good reason, because since we've seen now in 2022, going all the way back to the 90s, that we're observing these bodybuilders observationally, that they're doing something that's improving their anthropometrics on game day. Now, this is not to say that they're doing it the best way, that there aren't some consequences visually that come with improving like those measurements, nor do we know which ones are more successful, which ones are less, which is why we need to test things. But we know that almost all bodybuilders peak. Some of the bodybuilders who we observe, and the majority, seem to improve their measurements. Carbohydrate loading works, and then the missing kind of piece that we don't have, because the typical plan is carbohydrate load and then dry out, like fill, dry out, right? We don't have much on that drying out process, and that's a very controversial topic, and it's also very different in different aspects of bodybuilding. So as like I was mentioning earlier, the Venn diagram that we operate in. You've probably heard a lot of the pushback against the idea of dehydration and the idea that you can actually manipulate intracellular to extracellular water and some of the issues with some of the underlying assumptions. And I've voiced my concerns about that. And anecdotally, I can just say that my anecdotal experiences don't match up with the anecdotal experience of the guys I've talked to and the gals I've talked to on the enhanced side. Mm-hmm. From what I understand, the majority of the people on the enhanced side of the fence do that traditional approach in some way, or at least follow those principles. And they feel that visually, when they reduce total body water and they do dehydration practices, they look better. That is not what I've observed as a natural bodybuilder. And I've also come to learn that I'm not alone. So that same 2019 survey of 81 UK-based natural bodybuilders, I think only like 13 or 14% of them restricted sodium. Only 32% of them restricted water, and there were actually like 19% of them, so not a lot of them, but more than restricted, who actually loaded sodium. So it's a practice that is occurring in a large minority of individuals on the natural side. They are doing some type of quote unquote drying out process, but the majority of people are not. They're not restricting sodium. They're not cutting water, and that is, I think, something that's matched my experiences. There are still some people who do some of these dehydration practices on the natural side of the sport, but they're way less common, and they're no longer in the majority. They used to be in my anecdotal experiences. And I think that bodybuilders being so analytical, so meticulous, and it being a competitive sport, they're going to trend towards things that quote unquote work. Mm-hmm. And we've talked about this before, sometimes people don't want to include anecdotes or observations on the pyramid of evidence at all. Like, just want to cut off that bottom part, right? No, that doesn't count. But anecdotes, they aren't empirical observations because they haven't been, verified, and they're not tested against anything. They're not studies, but they do have some value. We know that at the very least, if a lot of people are doing something and succeeding, that it's at least not preventing them from succeeding. So anecdotes, a lot of the times, that the common thing people say, hey, it worked for me. That's a true statement. Like, it was good enough. Could it be better? Were there some things that were unnecessary? Were there some things that were harming the process, but the net outcome was still a net positive, as I like to say? Sure, those things are probably likely true. So the fact that almost all bodybuilders do this, and that the observations we have do show some indications of a positive change, I think those are relatively encouraging. And it is interesting that we've seen this divergence on the enhanced and natural side of the sport. So why are enhanced athletes doing it one way? Why are natural athletes doing it another way? I think you could very strongly suggest that it has to do with tradition and just different voices, but I don't think that's all of it. I just have a tough time. I think it would be arrogant of me to say that we just have it right on the natural side and they're just dumb on the enhanced side. Like, I don't think that's it, you know? So, and some of my conversations I've had, you know, like shout out to Mike Israetel, he was sharing with me some of his processes as he went through contest prep. And depending on what approach you're taking and what special sports supplements that are involved, there may be a lot more water retention than there would be in a quote unquote natural state, you know? So go ahead, Omar.
Eric, real quick. So John Meadows, rest in peace. I remember he brought up something, and this isn't me trying to be like needlessly combative between sides, but he did make a joke where he said, and kind of to Mike Israetel's point, that basically said natural bodybuilders have to do more things right than enhanced bodybuilders because you could basically mask what you're doing by other mechanisms. And so basically natural bodybuilders in ways, and those that study them, are pioneers because they actually get down to the nitty gritty. Forget like that potentially holding on to more water. And I wonder, like, obviously the validity of that, but the kernel of truth with John Meadows, I do think is true, and I don't think this is combative, is that in the natural bodybuilding community, such as we're arguing tradition versus like actually the outcome, like what works, counting macronutrients or all these other things, a lot of innovations, I'll just say, at least from my personal subjective standpoint, have come from the natural bodybuilding side, almost out of necessity to try and produce an end result that's impressive, period. That's all.
I think it's that and something else too, Omar. Yeah. I think when there are less levers to pull, it's an inherently less complex equation. So I think to give some credit to the enhanced side, I think I know what you're talking about with John Meadows. He did actually mention that on the podcast, and he's expressed that to me. And I think he's someone who always wants to reach that olive branch out. He's one of the few guys who, once he started coaching, probably started with more enhanced athletes, but then eventually he got to the point where he probably had more natural clients because he did such a good job of bridging the gaps and showing his bona fides in both. So, you know, rest in peace. There's hasn't been anyone like him since. It hasn't been that long, and he's definitely sorely missed. But I think he did a great job of unifying bodybuilders, and him as a coach getting very good at working with bodybuilders. You know, big picture.
Yep.
So I will say that yes, if you want to have an impressive physique, you have to maximize the variables that are in front of you. But I don't know that that's not true, just with more variables on the enhanced side. And it makes it more complex. You know, what Mike was sharing with me was, you know, there are sometimes 5-10 kilogram, not in all cases, not as normal, but swings in water weight that can happen throughout the course of a prep. And that can make it way more confusing. It can lead you down, you know, false conclusions. And I think it has made the process harder. But at the same time, it means that there are things that can supersede some of the stuff that we focus on as natural bodybuilders. They can have larger effects and some things that we simply don't have to deal with. And this isn't just speculation or, hey, like, you know, my evidence to this is DMs from Mike Israetel. There's like data on this too. So like there's a lot of research. If you just type in like water retention, anabolic steroids, you can find a lot of studies, you know, like, and it's not just anabolic steroids. There's other drugs as well. There's a study by Johansson and colleagues, independent and combined effects of testosterone and growth hormone on extracellular water in hypopituitary men. And it's basically a study that's showing that there is independent and additive effects on extracellular water retention from taking both testosterone as well as growth hormone. And there are, you know, similar findings in other synthetic versions of testosterone, like I think nandrolone. I saw a study on that as well. And then I actually found a study that is on, it's not like they measured water compartments, but it's like a qualitative research study of user experiences. It was published in the Journal of Substance Abuse by McVeigh and colleagues. And it's DNP. I don't want to say the drug name because I'll get it wrong and sound dumb. Yep. But it's a DNP, the Inferno drug, a ethnographic study of user experiences in the quest for leanness. And one of the things that you will read in the user experiences is that it creates a lot of water retention. So not only on the muscle building side of the equation, but also on some of the cutting drugs that are used, can you see these big swings in water retention? So that may be the difference, you know, when you're on the enhanced side of the sport, when there is less research on these drugs, and when you're, you know, in a different stream of information, like they're looking up to the guys and the gals who are competing at the Olympia or the Arnold, etc. I don't know that their experiences apply to everyone, because the difference between natural is there's not degradations of natural. Like we joke about it like half natty, but like the stuff that the amateur versus the pro natural bodybuilder are doing are the same. They just have different genetics or different time in the sport. But that's not the case. Like someone who is, competing in their first novice division in an untested show is probably natural in most cases.
Yep.
And then when they do the open 2 years later, they might be on 1/10 of the stack that Mr. Olympia or Miss Olympia is on. So I do wonder, because like I have seen many people at the amateur level in untested shows just have wildly shitty peaks.
Yep.
Yeah. And most of the studies from the 90s were on like NPC nationals, like high level competitors. Like I do think some of the borrowed practices that get filtered down, because they're drug and drug dose and drug interaction specific, they probably get lost in translation. And I think that happens less on the natural side. But nonetheless, I guess what I'm getting at is there are both anecdotal experiences that back this up, as well as research on the way drugs affect water balance, that it may be a net positive to do some dehydration practices on the enhanced side to improve your appearance.
Yep.
Even if it might, reduce some muscle water, and it might make you a little bit smaller. Like if you look like a bloated whale unless you do this stuff, and I mean obviously exaggerating, then you're just, it's going to be like showing up to a baseball game without a mitt. Like I have to do this to look like a bodybuilder on stage, or I'm just so watery that it doesn't matter.
Yep.
So that's why I think the perspective, it's so wildly different when I talk to some of these cats who are on the enhanced side.
Yep.
And they don't even it doesn't even click with them when I tell them, yeah, my guys drink the normal amount or slightly more water on game day. And then to make sure they don't wash out too much of their sodium, we can still get a pump and they look full. We load sodium, because it's literally the exact opposite of what they do. Like they start sipping water on Friday night before the show, keeping water low and dropping sodium.
Yep.
And I'm telling them, no, we keep the water the same or increase it, and we kick up sodium a little bit acutely close to the show. It's like, you watch their brains explode. And then when you show them the pictures of people and they're like, they look so dry, and I'm like, they're not dry. Like they're really wet. Like their water balance is probably the highest it has been.
Yep.
So that is like kind of where we were at anecdotally before the Nunes study came out, which is the preceding study to the study by Barakat, the case study of himself. So I'm kind of building this train of how did we get here? So Nunes came out, I reviewed it in mass, and it was a really cool idea. And the fact that they got bodybuilders to come in, do their anthropometrics, and then do some bioimpedance tests. Your first thought when you hear bioimpedance is, oh, isn't that like the shitty body comp thing, like those scales where you drink a little water and it messes up?
Yeah.
The thing to remember, though, is that bioimpedance, it sends electrical signals through your body. So while it is using equation and assumptions about water distribution among tissues to make estimations of body fat, it is more of a direct measure of water than anything else, besides it's actually like, dissecting someone and, like sponging them apart to see where their water balance was. So bioimpedance is a more direct measure of water than it is a direct measure of body composition. And I was pretty excited. Okay, they did some bioimpedance measurements, but unfortunately, they used what's called a single frequency bioimpedance device. Now, why is that relevant? What does that mean? So if you want to make inferences about different body water compartments between extracellular and intracellular fluids, you can't do that with one frequency. You need to use multiple frequencies, so bioelectrical impedance spectroscopy with a multi-frequency device, because you can use one frequency that doesn't penetrate the intracellular space and another frequency that does. And then you can mathematically determine, based upon those currents and the time to travel, what total body water is doing, and then what the extracellular and intracellular compartments are doing. So unfortunately, Nunes didn't do that. So what they did is they did a single frequency assessment, and then they used estimation equations based upon athletes. Unfortunately, we're talking like soccer players.
Yeah.
So, untested high-level bodybuilders in Brazil probably look a little different in terms of their body dimensions and hydration values than you'd expect for athletes. And also, to get accurate values on these equations, you have to have people at the same time of day in a euhydrated state, not manipulating their water, not manipulating their training, consistent diet. It's the exact opposite of what you're doing in peak week. You're literally manipulating all those variables to see how it affects water balance. So in an ideal condition, we're looking at errors of like 4 to 6 liters of water for each one of those compartment assessments. So that's like 4 to 6 kilograms of water error when you like use a single frequency bioimpedance device and estimate extra, intra, and total body water compartment size.
Yeah.
And that's when you do it all right. And basically they couldn't do any of that. So unfortunately, I think the Nunes study can't tell us anything about the body water. And what they observed was, exactly what we expected. Like intracellular went up, extracellular went down, and they look great, right? Or they improved their waist and arm size. But if you look at it, I think it kind of broke the equation a little bit. It started to peak out, and they even reported that the highest intracellular and extracellular water ratios ever observed in the research were observed in their study. They saw that as evidence of the fact that bodybuilders are doing exactly what they expect, and it has the predicted effect on appearance. I think that was evidence that they tried to use a single frequency device in an equation that wasn't built for them and kind of didn't work.
Yep.
So that's where we were left off. And I was like, oh, dang, that this is cool. It's observational confirmation that, waist circumference and arm circumference improve one day out. So, they're doing something right. But it doesn't tell us anything about, is that relationship between anthropometry and body water the traditional narrative that we hear in bodybuilding? And that's where the case study on Barakat actually comes in. They used a multi-frequency bioelectrical spectroscopy device, and also not just looking at circumferences, they used ultrasound measurements of the adipose tissue layer thickness as well as muscle thickness. So they did 7 sites for how thick the skin was, and then 4 sites for how thick the musculature was, and looked at this change starting at 6 days out, and then 3, 2, 1 day out, and then morning of the competition, while Chris manipulated all his case study stuff. And this is where it gets really interesting. So overall, you could say that this was a successful peak week. Okay, and the reason I say that is because his skin folds on the morning of the competition, the sum of those 7 sites was the lowest. It was 29.6 millimeters in total across all the sites, which was just slightly lower than it was at baseline. So he started out at 29.8 before peak week, did some carb loading, and then brought the skin folds back down to just below that baseline level. You could argue that 29.8 versus 29.6, even across 7 sites, that could be due to measurement error. But as you add up more sites, that measurement error is going to be less likely to be the cause. So it's at least equal to his lowest skin fold measurement. More convincingly, though, is that his sum of 4 muscle thickness sites was about half a centimeter higher than at baseline. So due to carbohydrate loading, it got up reasonably high, and then basically was at that same point within 0.01 centimeters on game day. So the best combination of muscle and and adipose tissue layer thicknesses occurred on the morning of the competition. And his subjective fullness, which was just a 1 to 10 rating of how full do you feel, was the highest on the morning of. And then if you actually speak to Chris, subjectively, person to person, he'd say, yeah, he had a good peak. Mm-hmm. He hadn't felt a pump that good. So subjectively, it seemed to have worked. And objectively, you could certainly make an argument that these were certainly modest, small changes, but the best combination of, skin and muscle thicknesses occurred on game day after his procedure. What's wild, though, is that polar opposite of Nunes is that when you look at the water compartments, they go the exact opposite direction of the narrative, okay? So an interesting thing occurred. They looked at the intracellular to extracellular water ratio. That is hypothesized to be high after carbohydrate loading, right? The highest ICW to ECW ratio occurred after carbohydrate depletion. So they depleted carbohydrates, and ICW to ECW was highest when they were flattest, right? Skin folds actually went up by about 10%. Muscle thicknesses, went down during carbohydrate depletion. But the ratio said, hey, based on the traditional narrative, you should be looking amazing right now. All that intracellular water, right? So the reason why the ratio was so high is because it is a ratio. So if total body water goes down and it's largely from extracellular and intracellular maintains, then the ratio will be high, but you might still look really flat, And so that's the first indication of, maybe this relationship isn't quite what it's traditionally proposed as. But then it gets even wilder. So on the morning of the competition, the highest combination, the highest total body water extracellular water and intracellular water were the highest in the whole week-long study period or 8-day study period when he probably looked his best, at least when skin thicknesses were lowest, muscle thicknesses were highest. He also had the highest body weight on the scale. So body weight was highest, which is something that sometimes traditionally you look for the body weight to drop because you've quote unquote dropped water. Body weight was highest on the lab scale. Skin thicknesses were lowest, muscle thicknesses were highest, and all body water compartments were highest. Now, the authors did mention, and this is more of a technical note, but it still kind of confirms the same thing, that there are inbuilt equations, even though you've got this multi-frequency device, that make assumptions about the cylindrical shape of the human body. And it's not a cylindrical shape, right, to make these estimations, and even less so in a bodybuilder, right? The legs and the arms don't look like, pencils, right? So sure, there could be some error there. So one of the things they did was they specifically looked at some of the raw data. So you can analyze phase angle, reactance, and resistance, and also do something, and shout out to Grant Tinsley, who's one of the authors on this paper, who knows this far better than I do, so I'm kind of just parroting what was said in the paper. They did what's called a bioimpedance vector analysis, which looks at the changes in these variables to see whether or not there's an indication of whether you're moving towards more body water or less. And so, removing some of those equations, which might have thrown a wrench into the works, the BIVA analysis, that bioimpedance vector analysis, indicated that body water was increasing into game day. So all variables indicated that body water was going up and or was highest on show day when he looked his best. So that goes in polar opposition to the narrative. And you may be asking yourself, well, why? But it makes sense. Like, you want more intracellular, like in the muscle cell, and you want less extracellular, like, in the subcutaneous layer. And that right there is the false equivalence that has been at the root of this kind of house of cards, which I've always questioned. Maybe not always, but as soon as I started thinking about it from like an empirical perspective. Because intramuscular is not equivalent to intracellular, and extracellular is not equivalent to subcutaneous. Yes, under the umbrella of the extracellular space, subcutaneous is included, but it's by no means the largest space. The entire vascular system, your capillaries, arteries, veins, you name it, that is extracellular, right? On top of that, like, if Omar, you ever looked at one of those textbooks where it shows like the muscle belly at the largest level, like from the tendon to the muscle, and then it shows like the epimysium, and then underneath it shows like the fascicles, and then the paramysium, and then it shows like the actual bundles all the way down to the sarcomere. Yeah. Everything that's not actually within the muscle cell itself, that's extracellular space. The paramysium, the endomysium. So there's a whole lot of space for fluids to be that's intramuscular that is still extracellular. And I think that's a really important thing to consider. And when you think about getting like a sick pump, you're actually increasing extracellular water in the muscle when you get a local pump. You're increasing intracellular water as well, but this delineation between intracellular good, extracellular bad is it's a false equivalency. So when you are trying to think about like what is going to have the largest impact on visual muscle size, I don't think it's a direct one-to-one of ICW and high, ECW low, So yeah, and I think also because of the experiences on the enhanced side of the sport, there's almost this assumption that like the quote-unquote natural state of the body is one of unexpected water retention in unexpected places. But that's really just not the case. And another interesting thing that was observed, that there was only like a 7% change in the ICW to ECW ratio throughout this whole case study. And that makes sense. Like, there needs to be a tightly regulated intracellular to extracellular fluid ratio, or we fucking die. Yeah. Like, it's important, you know? So we have like multiple redundant feedback loops. And when you actually do subvert this and you change it substantially, we do see bodybuilders die. Like some of the high profile deaths, like Andreas Munzer and a few others, and also deaths in endurance athletes and also wrestlers, like either due to hyponatremia or cutting weight, is when you mess with fluid balance and electrolyte balance to the point where you actually do subvert these feedback systems. And, like, it kills you, unfortunately. Kidney failure or even heart failure in some cases. So the idea that this like needs to be manipulated at a baseline, I think probably should be questioned. So this is, like I said, a case study. So coming back to like the empirical thing, like we can't say this was the only way that it works in people, the best way, something different couldn't have occurred, or isolate the variables of what caused what. But I think what we can say, when you think about what does it take to disprove a theory, any evidence to the contrary. Like if you want to have a universal theory of, hey, this is the way it works, all you have to do is find one piece of evidence that shows that's not the way that works, and we have to abandon that theory or modify it. And I would say that any theory that states that to look your best, you need to have extracellular water lower and intracellular water higher, or you need to have the highest ICW to ECW ratio, at the very least, this case study suggests we need to question that. And I know that seems like an innocuous statement to you, Omar, just because of the circles you run in, but that's like tantamount to heresy in like mainstream bodybuilding.
Sure.
You know, because people have been saying this since like, you know, Dan Duchaine in the 80s, you know, and this is like the textbook way with science-based references, and I didn't say evidence-based there for a reason, that people think it works. And it's just not what was observed. And I think what it comes down to is we probably need to take a step back and stop constructing these 200 references, 20,000 word explanations of here's the way it works without empirical support. Because I could write a review paper and you could write a review paper and they would be in polar opposition and they both seem sciencey, but neither one actually has that true evidential support. And now we're just starting to get it, which is why I think this case study by Barakat is important.
This man really out here being Martin Luther, just nailing it right to the wall. Eric, I want to say, so what you said with anecdotes being at the bottom of the pyramid, but nonetheless being at the bottom, that there's that old adage about like white swans, the idea that all swans are white, but all it takes is one black swan to disprove that entirely. At the very least, with this anecdote here, with this case study of what's going on with Chris, it raises a lot of questions. And kind of what you were saying before, like when we had that conversation, it was with Knuckles. I think, was it with Trex, or who's the second person, Eric?
It was, what you mean about empiricism versus rationalism? Yeah. It was the whole crew, homie. We had
Zerdos,
we had Trexler, we had...
I was thinking, okay. Yeah. Because I was going to say that... one of the issues too when you kind of start developing some of those layered assumptions is that all it takes is one of the foundational aspects of it for it not to pan out for the whole thing to say wait a second here, like you got to go back to block one.
Yeah,
I want to take, so there's many different avenues to go here, but one I immediately want to jump to, just talking about the natural side versus the enhanced side. Correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but from a personal standpoint, you're like, bro, don't bring up my 2019 prep. But when on show day, like some of the things, I want to know the origin. Basically, I want to know because Chris is basically carrying out something that came, I assume, from the natural side that was contrary once again at some theoretical point in the 90s, 2000, like whenever you guys first heard about it, started doing it, and you noticed it was producing superior results. Did you not, when I did see it at the 2019 River City Royal Rumble, you wanted not to spill over? Remember that, but you're considering like sodium, the water, all that stuff. Like, oh my God, Jeff Alberts was there. I remember my man was eating his tuna with his bread, right? Do you not enact, I'm just saying for you on a personal standpoint, something relatively similar to what Chris is doing here?
You know, the interesting thing about Chris here, from talking to him, and also if you look at his co-authors, some of them are people who have espoused and I don't mean this as disparaging, because I do think, like I said, it might apply on the enhanced side, like Scott Stevenson and Guillermo Escalante. They both follow more that traditional narrative.
Yep.
And I would say what Chris did is kind of like a less extreme hybrid approach.
Okay.
So like if you actually look at what he did carbohydrate deplete early in the week. So he had his carbs like on day 6 through 4 days out.
Yep.
They were between like 70 to 90 grams. He had a higher fat intake, lower calorie intake, kept his water intake normal, and then his sodium was like relatively low, and his potassium and sodium didn't change a whole hell of a lot, but basically he did carb deplete.
Yep.
Then he did a carb load over 2 days. So 3 days out and 2 days out, he was nearly 600 grams of carbs, and kept water high. In fact, actually increased it while carb loading. And then 1 day out, he did he lowered his carbs, but not low carb. So like, I think his baseline diet was between like 250 to 300 grams of carbs. He was like at 400 grams of carbs 1 day out. So he lowered it from the carb load. And then his water, he just like barely tapered it. So he went from just under 7 liters of water per day during like the the pre-loading part of the show. Then he got up to 9 and 11 liters while carb loading. And then he dropped it down to like 6 liters on the day prior. So it was like 87% of his habitual intake, but after 2 days of it being, 25, 40% higher. So there was like a slight water taper, a slight sodium taper. So like his total sodium on like 1 day out was like 4.2 grams. And then the few days before that, it was between like 4.4 to like 5.3. So I would say his sodium was basically the same. For how well the sodium is regulated, I would say he didn't change sodium and that he had a very slight taper in water before, leading into that morning of measurement. So that's like a conservative kind of traditional approach, I would say, like really conservative compared to some of the stuff I've heard guys do. Yeah. As far as what I do and what we do with a lot of our 3DMJ athletes is we actually maintain a high water intake throughout. And one of the things that we want to see on game day is the person having multiple frequent, mostly clear urinations.
Yep.
And if you think about it, high water intake, like I said, it does increase urinary output. It induces diuresis, but it induces diuresis while maintaining hydrated tissues. So if you're drinking a whole lot of water, you're not going to have tissues that are dehydrated. You're not peeing out that much. You're just maintaining your current hydration levels by having a high level of urinary output. And that works fine if there's no reason for there to be water retention, right? Makes sense. So that's probably why, that's not something you see on the enhanced side very much. An important thing, though, if anyone's ever heard of hyponatremia, this is the idea of drinking, well, this is the common cause, drinking so many fluids that it actually washes out electrolytes and your sodium levels get too low and you can actually have heart complications, kidney complications. It can be very serious. So that's another reason why we actually try to increase sodium on game day, because water intake is high. They might be sweating, they're pumping up, they're going to be more active on game day. It depends on time of year as well and the climate they're used to. But we add sodium also to make sure that they can get a pump, their blood pressure is not too low, because it's really common. You stand up and you get lightheaded during contest prep. So acute sodium increase on game day while we're keeping water high to make sure that they're peeing clearly. And I think that's something that we see consistently work well for a lot of people. And then the variable piece actually for us is more carbohydrates. And just tailoring that to get to the point where they are full and appropriately full. And that is super individual. Interesting thing, one of the few pieces of statistics that was actually done in this case study, because in case studies you don't compare groups, but you can look at associations. They found a nearly significant relationship between carbohydrate intake and muscle thicknesses. And they actually have a figure in this case study. I think it's figure 3, if I recall correctly, or it might be figure 2. Where they overlay over from 9 days out to comp day, the carbohydrate intake and muscle thickness, and they follow like very similar like curves, which is pretty cool. And they did like a non-linear correlation, and it was pretty strong, like 0.733. So it explains, I think like roughly 50% of the variance in muscle thickness is explained by carbohydrate and vice versa. And it was nearly significant, like 0.056. And that's just, basically looking at repeated measurements in an individual. So that's pretty cool. So it was a Kendall's tau of 0.73 for the stats nerds. But anyway, it's that kind of confirms what we know about carbohydrate intake. And the carbohydrate aspect, I think, is really important. And the traditional narrative, kind of going back to that very first recommendation I gave, is, hey, if you load carbohydrates early and then cut water, you're okay. You won't be flat because you're still going to maintain that 3-to-1 ratio. But there's a really cool study by Fernandez Elias that came out in 2015 where they took these cyclists and they had them do a depletion protocol on a cycle. And then they fed them carbohydrates without water in one condition. So they were dehydrated. And then another condition, they fed them carbohydrates with water. And the dehydrated cyclists, and they did a muscle biopsy. So this isn't an estimation. This isn't like they weren't like doing a bioelectrical spectroscopy. They looked at the actual muscle and assessed its hydration values under the microscope. I'm not going to pretend to understand the methods, but they did a biopsy. They cut some muscle out of these people. They looked at the ratio of glycogen to water, and it was 1-3, kind of that typical expected physiological textbook amount in the dehydrated group of cyclists. But in the well-hydrated cyclists, it was 17-1. So for every gram of, 1-17, for every gram of glycogen, it had 17 grams of water. And I can 100% tell you that many times I've seen people who load carbs and then cut water and they still look flat.
Yep.
And they think that this, glycogen is going to protect them, but there can actually be a 6-fold difference in muscle water between someone who is loaded carbohydrate and someone who is not. And that osmotic, pressure of intramuscular carbohydrate is so important, and it makes the biggest impact. But there is also the time lag, quote unquote, spilling over, or the quote unquote load look that Cliff Wilson might talk about. There does seem to be a period of time, like after you carb load, where your body has to kind of get back to normal water balance, where you look blurry at first, where we think that there's water that's from that process of being pulled into the muscle. If you try to load too quickly or load too much, if there's no more space for glycogen, that water has to go somewhere, and then it'll eventually kind of rebalance. You'll pee it out or whatever. Sometimes it can just get fixed overnight, but there's a lag there, and that is actually what was observed. So the skin folds went from 29.8 for Chris, and then after the first day of carbohydrate loading, they actually went up during carbohydrate depletion, but they continued to go up after loading, and they reached like 32.9. And then it took a couple days for that to kind of quote unquote get fixed and hit that low point. So for anyone who wants to have some other practical takeaways, this is a validated observation that matches my anecdotal experiences, that you have to be very careful carbohydrate loading in close proximity to your show, because it takes some time. But the good news is that muscle glycogen doesn't go anywhere unless it's depleted. And like just being on a low calorie or low carbohydrate diet will deplete it a little bit, but it's the exercise. So what you'll typically see bodybuilders do anecdotally is they stop their training a couple days out, and they typically do their harder training early in the week. They'll do like legs and then push, then pull, and then take a couple days off, and then they'll compete. So that allows you to kind of taper down into the show, but still maintain that fullness. And I think the only mistake, at least for natural competitors, is to cut water in conjunction with that. So all of that is basically what Chris did. Chris didn't really cut water, didn't really cut sodium. He did load carbohydrates early, and he tapered off his training. So I'm not surprised that he had a good peak. He didn't make any of the what I consider cardinal errors that I habitually observe cause these problems. So yeah, the approach I took in 2019, because glycogen doesn't go anywhere unless you deplete it. And I noticed that I can have a very kind of watery, quote unquote, response acutely in response to carbohydrate loading, is that I would typically finish loading sometime on midday Friday or Friday night. And my goal was to look a little spilled over Friday night, because I knew I'd wake up with that corrected. Yep. Just typically overnight is enough for someone to get back to a normal water balance. And then on game day, I would have like just enough to maintain the look. So it would be maintenance calories-ish on a moderate carbohydrate diet. So I might have loaded on 300 to 400 grams for a couple days prior, and then on game day, I would have probably 200 grams of carbs, which is similar to what Chris did, he just had more, And then differently, by the time you saw me, that was like what I did in April, but by the time in July and August, I had eaten up to the point where every day I was having, 300, 350 grams of carbs. So I didn't really need to do anything except bump up like 50 grams on the 2 days prior to the show, and then come back down 50 grams on show day. So that's kind of like eating up into the show, being ready early.
Eric, a lot of things. I know I'm aware of our time, so we'll wrap this up. But I will say that I find it intensely fascinating, one, how you said in the result for like Chris, as an example, successful peak week, that it might from the outside make minor differences. But as we know, with anything competitive, these minor differences can have major advantages when it comes time to compete. And so you do need to get into the weeds. You do need to get granular. And I just highly respect the methodical approach, even if like it's best practices given the information that you have, right? Sure. That people undertake. And I think if people from the outside understood what some people endeavor to do from the natural community, and we spoke about that before, about like natural competitors, it's kind of like a question of integrity, that which they undertake to do, that what they put their body through. If you really were to see all these different steps along the way to produce a desired outcome, I think one, people would find it a lot more impressive, but they would have also more respect for the general process, the commitment that it takes for someone to do. And I think you just even, Eric, what's so fun, like I was thinking about this when you're explaining like the peak process, and once again, what goes into it. And that's like one component of just many levels that all go into what contest prep the umbrella is called, that I do like. One of the other things, just real quick, I know these are, and we'll bring it full circle, man. I understand from someone who's competed in both powerlifting and bodybuilding, like where you do joke a little bit, because like I gotta be like, you know, like preparing for powerlifting and whatnot, like you're just controlling the train, like you're probably within weight for your all these things. It's like I think it would be far more intensive to prepare properly for a bodybuilding show. So even this, I think it's a super cool, even if people, you know, don't ever plan on competing, don't ever plan on having the necessity of a peak week, an inside peak, pun intended, to the process, I think is fantastic, actually.
Thanks, Omar. Yeah, and I think, you know, that this is basically just kind of a cool update on, because some people might look at, oh, cool, yeah, another case study on a bodybuilder. No. Like we've been doing that since Rosso 2013, but this is the first time we've had a full deep dive inside look with a lot of data collected. So, you know, kudos to Barakat and colleagues. They did ultrasound. They did a lot of things. So they got DEXA as well. That, like, all the changes were within the margin of error from day to day. So I really focused on the ultrasound stuff, which is a little more minute. But, you know, they did, you know, like I said, DEXA, they did ultrasound skin, they did ultrasound of the muscles, they did equations to estimate body fat percentage. They tracked his macros from starting 9 days out. They even tried to get pictures, and this is actually the one thing that I wish this study would have had, but I was talking to Chris, they weren't able to kind of replicate the lighting conditions. So if anyone wants to do a study like this, collaborate with a photographer. But yeah, like I said, that study by Desmarais is really cool because they did that photo silhouette comparison. And I would really love to see, you probably know what you need to do, and what I plan to do. Shout out to Kai, who's probably currently listening to this and doing our our timestamps and references and things like that, is get judges from a different region and then send, you know, blacked out face physique shots so that people can assess, oh, did they improve from baseline? Yep. And then see basically the same thing they did with Desmarais, but include the whole physique. Because like I said, if the skin thicknesses go up in response to carbohydrate loading, but you look fuller, that will show an improvement on silhouettes, but it might actually not if you were looking at an actual high def picture. So I think we need to get more data on the time course, and what would really be awesome to confirm what we think happened. Presumably Chris looked great on game day, you know, based upon his ultrasound assessment. But what we need to know is, like, if we had bodybuilding judges look at him at 6 days out, 3 days out, 2 days out, 1 day out, game day, and to see, was it actually visually confirmed? Because it's subjective data, but it's a subjective sport. So that's the true metric that we need to really kind of get an idea on this. And certainly there is a challenge of trying to get full, but also be tight and defined on game day because of that effect where carbohydrates are so osmotic that you get these temporary levels of blurriness when you load carbs, but you get fuller. So finding the right balance of how much carbohydrate, when, for how long, to achieve that look. At least that's as complicated as it gets on the natural side, in my opinion, unless there's some reason that someone's retaining water, maybe menstrual cycle related, or they're extremely stressed out. But on the enhanced side, it is a much more complex thing. And I would not at all be surprised if instead of being a little more critical of thinking, oh, they're doing it this old school way, like, no, I mean, this may be because the drugs are causing that type of water retention. So I would love to see these types of studies include pictures. Of course, do it on more than one person, but it could still be this kind of observational, kind of quasi-experimental design where you observe a bunch of different bodybuilders, right? And they take their different approaches to quote unquote drying out, or not, like wetting up, you know, like was the case in this one. Or like what we do with our athletes, and, you know, observe this relationship between multi-frequency assessed, you know, body water compartments and visual appearance, as well as anthropometry, and then see, okay, if we separate everyone who did more of a traditional approach versus a less traditional approach, and then did they improve, and then is that also then differentiated by whether they're enhanced or not? And I think it's going to take us a decade before we get to that point where we have all this data accumulated and we really do have an empirical case to back one strategy or two different strategies in two different populations. But I would say where we're at right now, that's probably what's shaking out. And I think it's an exciting time to be kind of on the ground level with research being done on something that I don't think we could even previously have really assessed.
Oh, Eric, the forward arrow of progress. Let's go, Kai. It blew my mind when you said that 5 to 10 kilo weight fluctuation with the water on the enhanced side, which is like, I suppose no one on the hand side.
Now, granted, that is like a heavyweight bodybuilder.
Yeah.
So,
and what you said too about the enhanced side as well. Additionally, that it's drug dependent, like dose dependent in terms of drugs. So you take like a novice compared where it scales up, whereas a natural competitor, like basically your peak is going to be always like relatively similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Like if you take a first time actually enhanced competitor and they're doing like just testosterone and maybe like clenbuterol or something, and I'm guessing, and nothing else during their prep, that's way different than someone who's on insulin, growth hormone, a gram of test, and like DNP. Like, that's like they are, the former is probably maybe a little closer to a drug-free competitor. So, and the approach probably needs to be, taken into consideration with that. So anyway, that's all I got, Omar, but I thought this would be a cool update on this topic.
Now, Eric, once again, whereas I'm bunting, my man is knocking it out of the park. You are right now Joe Carter, the Blue Jays, hitting the grand slam for us, getting the W, because you're part of Team Toronto here. I did want to give just this hilarious story about DMP, but we'll save it for another time. But that is a whole that's a whole other story. We'll wrap this up, Eric. I'll say thank you so much, man, for once again joining me in another episode of Iron Culture. I think once again you do a really good job of giving this inside perspective. And someone on the outside, I'm joking, Eric. Someone's like, cool, peak week. Yeah. So anyways, on IG, there's this filter called Structure. So you just turn it up, right? It's like, oh, you do all the stuff to look 2% better. Yeah, it's called Structure on social. No. Can I just say, Eric, this is wild too, that so we only know the first layer of, let's say, photo manipulation via social media. Like that's
Structure.
Step one. And like it gets scary. Like I'm telling you this, I have seen people look not good in person, but their photos look astounding due to all the effort. And they're not using it's lighting trickery, but they're not using, when they say actual Photoshop, so the manipulation of the photo inside like the assets to like, enhance muscles or whatever. But anyways, God, I love those that endeavor to go all the way and the journey therein. And I do think it takes on that personal dimension, man. So anyways, I'll say thank you to everyone for listening to another episode of Iron Culture. You go ahead and leave a rating and review. We will read another one in the next episode. We had address that controversy about Waterworld. You know where we stand. We're only here, only the high quality stuff. It has to have an IMDb rating of stuck together. Yes, stuck together, not stuck on you, or higher, because that is the gold standard for us. We appreciate you listening to another episode of Iron Culture, and we'll catch you in that next one every single Monday.